Well, good morning, David Gates. I understand you're at Monte Bello this morning in California. We appreciate your joining us.
Hi, wait, it's good to be here.
So I just would encourage everyone as we start talking to pour themselves a glass of the Pagani Ranch Zinfandel. We don't want to forget that this is a wine tasting, not a wine lecture. And I want to tell you that I'm an enormous fan of your wines and have been for a long, long time. And I don't know if you're probably not aware of this, but I have a history with Paul. Going back pretty far. Are you familiar with a doctor named Marvin Overton? Are you old enough to remember Marvin Overton, who was a huge wine collector in the 80s and 90s? And he was,
no, I'm sorry.
He was always, well, you're too young, but he was always in Wine Spectator for these events that he had at his ranch in Fort Worth, where he would open 100 vintages of Chateau Latour or whatever, and invite people for the weekend to taste, 30 vintages on Friday, 30 vintages on Saturday, and 30 vintages on Sunday. And yeah, I think in about 1989, I answered the phone at my restaurant in Nashville, and it was Marvin Overton. This voice said, "This is Marvin Overton, it's Hoyt there." And I just assumed it was someone playing a prank on me. I couldn't imagine why Marvin Overton would be calling me at my little tiny corner restaurant, strip mall restaurant in Nashville. And he said, I want to give a major event to the Cancer Benefit Wine Auction this year in Nashville, and I was hoping you would partner with me in it. My thought is that we will have a major tasting of Height's Martha's Vineyard. And I'll donate all the wine, and I'll pay for Joe and Martha Height's to come, and Bella and Barney Rhodes to come, and all that, if you'll donate your restaurant for the day. And it's kind of one of those, be careful what you ask for things, because all of a sudden, I'd always thought, wouldn't it be cool to be part of one of those Marvin Overton events? And then, it's going to cost me several $1,000s to be part of this Marvin Overton event. But we had the event with Joe, and that's another story. It was, if you knew Joe or know Joe's reputation, you wouldn't be surprised that there were difficult moments during the day where he lost his temper because of something someone said. But I knew that he had this reputation of being extremely difficult to deal with. So I wanted to do something to try to temper that. And I asked and asked and asked. Someone finally told me that he was a door gunner on I think it was a P-58 night fighter in World War II, and it was something that was really, really important to him. So I got a carver in Boston to do a replica of this aircraft that he flew in World War II, and put it on a pedestal and with a brass plaque that said in honor of Joe Heights' contribution, service in the war. And it did make things better, but not really enough better, but it did make things better. And then the following year, Marvin called again and said, "I want to do it again with Robert Mondavi." And then the following year, he called and said, "I want to do it again with Paul Draper." So we had a Saturday event where in the morning, we tasted every vintage of Monte Bello that had been made to that time, which was probably 1993. And then that night we had a really fine dinner with large format bottles of some of the finest wines. So I actually have you can't see it, but I actually have the menu. All these years later, I have the menu here, and just with halibut, we served 1990 Santa Cruz Chardonnay, 1985 Monte Bello Chardonnay. With tuna, we served 1990 Geyserville and 1973 Geyserville. With a cod dish, we served 1989 and 1979 York Creek Petite Syrah. And then with venison fajitas, we served a Jeroboam of 1984 Monte Bello. And then with a kind of cheese course, we served with 1970 Monte Bello. And then we served the 78 late harvest Zinfandel with port influenced desserts. So I go way back with you and with Paul and your wine. Paul was there, of course, and
Yeah.
and I wanted to. So for Mondavi, for Robert Mondavi, I found out his secretary told me that he had a picture of him in his football uniform at Stanford, which I thought was kind of surprising since he wasn't a very big guy. So I got the athletic director at Vanderbilt University to contact the athletic director at Stanford, and they mocked up a uniform, a Stanford football uniform with Mondavi on the back and a helmet with the number and a football signed by the team that year. And that was the centerpiece when he sat down, and he looked at me puzzled. What is all this football stuff all about? Well, he played rugby at Stanford, not football. Of course, there was a picture of him on his office wall holding the ball, and they're kind of the same shape. And I guess she just thought it was a football, not realizing this 150-pound man couldn't possibly have played football at Stanford. But so the next year with Paul, I set the table with a trench coat and spyglass and houndstooth cap.
Perfect.
Because I know you know this, and there's a reference on your website to the fact that he spent time in Chile as a winemaker, but it doesn't say that he was actually in Chile as an agent for the OSS, and the winemaking was just his cover. Why he was in Chile, he was actually there as a spy for the U.S. government.
Yes, but his heart was in the winemaking, definitely.
Well, I guess he was serving two masters, but
yes.
So that one worked. And Paul was a really lovely guy, and obviously, as you know, he's a very, very genteel, lovely man. And then one year I have so many Paul experiences, but one year at the Wine Spectator wine experience, it was one of the events was a vertical tasting of Mouton Rothschild, and I just by chance sat down and looked to my left, and Paul was sitting beside me, and he remembered me. And but when the 82 was served, he was talking under his breath about how flawed it was, which because technically it's a flawed wine. Because there's a lot of volatile acidity. But it's actually, it's one of the greatest wines ever made. It's just, in Paul's mind, it was undrinkable.
Yeah.
And I said, Paul, you're right. It's flawed, but it's also one of the greatest wines ever made. You kind of have to give it credit for being one of the greatest wines ever made. And then the next day.
And he kind of said, maybe.
Well, he is who he is. And one of the reasons for Ridge is his being who he is. And then the next day, he conducted a vertical tasting of Monte Bello and Chateau Latour. And there was no real, it was a Sunday event. It was a small event. There's no real sommelier assigned to that. But my plane was leaving later in the day, so I just stayed and helped him with the tasting. And I wish I remembered the vintages, but we tasted 6 vintages of Monte Bello and 6 vintages of the same vintage of Chateau Latour at the Sunday afternoon event, which was probably, if I hadn't drunk so much wine in my life and could remember it better, it was probably one of the greatest wine tastings I've ever been involved in. So that's my
awesome.
And I love Ridge wines so much that I love them in spite of the fact that Geyserville is my ex-wife's favorite red wine.
Well, she has good taste.
Well, a better tasting wine than men, I think. So
maybe. No, I won't go there.
So that's a way too long introduction to our conversation with you, but it is just, I do have this very emotional attachment to your wines, and it's one of the reasons I'm so excited to have this conversation with you this morning. So I must ask you to tell us a little bit. I mean, Ridge is such an important, historically important winery in California. I think one of the most, certainly maybe the most historically important winery in California is still in operation, because Mondavi's no longer Mondavi, and et cetera. So can you talk about that, about how Ridge began and this idea of these 100-year-old vines and I think most of them are
Yeah.
own rooted 100-year-old vines, right?
Well, yeah, a lot of them are on rootstock, but it was like this first replanting after they had died from phylloxera, because phylloxera, just like in Europe when phylloxera came in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, it made it to California about the same time, and so the oldest vineyards in the best places succumbed to phylloxera and then were replanted starting in about the 1880s on rootstock. But we can nerd out on that. Let's see, Ridge was originally several wineries on Monte Bello Road before Prohibition. I think there were 7 or 9 wineries up along the road. In the 1950s, late 50s, some partners, friends became partners in buying a property called the Torrey Ranch. And these friends were researchers from the Stanford Research Institute. They were brainiacs, right? They were pre-internet. One of the founders still has all the patents on the subway station signals to make sure that things don't crash and stuff. And they bought this place mainly up on Montebello Ridge so that they could get away from their high tech down at Stanford doing all the research, and their families could enjoy living, getting back to nature up on the mountain. Well, it came with 17 acres of grapes that had been planted 10 years before that by a theologian from Stanford, which is who they bought the property from. And so they were selling grapes. And in 1968, actually, Dave Benyon, who was 1958, Dave Benyon, the first winemaker for Ridge, made a barrel of wine in his garage on Palo Alto. And it turned out to be really good. He didn't know it because he had never made wine before. But that got them thinking about making a winery. So by 1962, they had bonded a winery, Ridge Vineyards. They wanted to call it Monte Bello because that was the most famous winery up on the top of this Monte Bello Ridge back before Prohibition. But that name was actually taken up by some spirits company. It had been sold off long ago. We were able to get it back in the 70s, though, which is kind of cool. So they set about, they were basically going to be a Cabernet house because that's mostly what they had grown here. There's a little bit of Chardonnay, a little bit of Ruby Cabernet, because the theologian from Stanford was friends with Harold Omo, a professor at UC Davis, who bred Ruby Cabernet and talked him into planting an acre of it, which is pretty funny.
That is so, one of the things I love about these conversations is these occasional references to things, because I've been doing this a while, these occasional references to things, from the past that, when was the last time I heard the phrase Ruby Cabernet? It was probably the 70s. I mean, it was probably Sebastiani or something. Ruby Cabernet.
Exactly.
We had a conversation with Joel Peterson recently, and he talked about Joseph Swan and Andrei Teletshev and Daryl Corti and people like that.
Yes.
Those are names that are so important, but you just don't hear them mentioned anymore. Well, so thank you for that.
No, you're very much welcome. So they wanted to make it a Cabernet house because that's what they had. But back then, the little bit of Cabernet that was grown in California was basically grown by wineries that were already making it. And there weren't really any Cabernet grapes for sale except very young vineyards. And they learned right away that yields from young vineyards could be all over the place, mostly high, and the quality would then be kind of all over the place. So they had already, by 64, they had reached out to some neighbors on Montebello Road, the Pachetti family that had some old pre-Prohibition Zinfandel vines, which are still in the ground. It's about an acre and a half little plot, and made wine from it. And then in 66, it's this fellow that was a land manager for the Schwabachers that had this beautiful ranch called Jimsomere toward the bottom of the hill at Montebello. Decided to sell. He had resurrected some also old pre-Prohibition Zinfandel vines, had pruned them after decades of neglect, and decided to offer the hippies on the top of the hill the grapes for sale. And we've been making wine from that ranch ever since. In fact, we partnered with them and planted it, and it's been a great relationship. They realized that older vineyards were made better wine, just more consistent. But back then, like I said, there were no older Cabernet vineyards that weren't already spoken for, but there are lots of Zinfandel vineyards. But by Zinfandel, I mean Zinfandel dominated vineyards. Anything that was pre-prohibition I've never seen a monovarietal pre-prohibition vineyard. So, which means that they're all mixed plantings. And if you think about it, the idea of making a varietal wine really didn't catch on until Schoonmaker and a few other, and a wine writer from New York that was actually a very good marketer, was looking for a way to push American wines against the wines of Europe. And he came up, as Frank Schoonmaker really pushed the idea of varietally labeling wines, which really hadn't been done to that point. And he partnered with a couple of vintners out in California. One of them is another old name that you don't hear much of, is Martin Ray, who is this fanatic in the Santa Cruz Mountains. He started Mount Eden Winery. He actually bought Paul Masson cellars from Paul Masson. I mean, he's just a character, and he was like maniacal about only making single varietal wine. So if it's Pinot Noir, there was nothing else in it. If it was, nothing else. Same thing with Cabernet. So,
are you implying that some famous Pinot Noirs today might have something other than Pinot Noir in them?
Oh, I would never say that. Ever. No, of course not.
Is there one that starts with an M? That
Possibly,
might have
but
something else in it.
I'm just saying that to be called a varietal wine, it only needs to be 75% or more. That's all I'll say. But what Frank Schoonmaker did really has taken off. So now all over the world, that's how people sell wines. Even in Europe, even in the old world, they sell them on their varietal labels. So, so if you look at old Zinfandel vineyards in California, they're always mixed. Well, the partners then decided that that's what they would kind of branch out to, and Zinfandel is still a large part of our portfolio. It's like 65% of what we do today. Then fast forwarding a little bit, by 69, they realized that if they were going to make this a viable concern, the Ridge Vineyards, that they needed to expand and get help in the cellar, and that's where they contacted Paul Draper, and he had just gotten back from Chile, because right about that time was when Allende took over the government, and they saw the change in the regime down in Chile, and so they got out. He and Fritz Maytag. So Paul was looking for a job. This was a perfect fit for him, and he's still chairman of the board today. So, and what Paul brought to the table was this focus on really treating the grapes with respect, and what he calls it, well, it's minimal intervention, but it means maximum attention, right? So you really pay attention to everything, so that you don't have to intercede just for the minimal amount, just enough to make sure the wine's clear and get it bottled and stuff. So he calls it pre-industrial winemaking. So in fact, the books that he learned how to make wine on were all from pre-prohibition, all from the 1880s. One from Emmett Rixford, who was a winemaker at it called La Cuesta Winery in Woodside, and we still use a clone of Cabernet that he originally got back in the 1880s from Bordeaux. So lots of history in that, and what Paul
David, how did they?
yeah.
David, how did they? I mean, had Paul been involved in the winemaking before going to Chile? What was his background?
No, so his background with wine. So he always says he wanted to go to Davis to get a winemaking degree, but his chemistry was so bad that he could never. He figured he'd never get accepted, so he just didn't do it.
Wow.
But so Paul, he grew up in the Midwest, and they didn't. And I grew up in the Midwest too, and that wine was not a part of everyday life. he grew up outside of Chicago. Where he learned about wine was when he was in the service in Italy and in France. So he learned as an adult, and he learned where wine is part of culture. It's part of the meal. It's on the dinner
Right.
table, and he learned. And he also rubs it in my face a little bit, not too much, but a little bit, that when he was getting into wine, you could buy really good first grows for like $6 a bottle or something, which was really, it wasn't as exorbitant as it was still a lot of money, but it wasn't as exorbitant as it is now. So he was able to try some of the best vintages, and he was able to try right after Prohibition in California, the wineries that started up, they still had memory. There, a lot of the winemakers that had been making wine before Prohibition continued it after. And so the wines, California wines from the 30s and almost into the 40s, were made by professionals that really knew what they were doing. And there were some fantastic wines from Inglenook. He could taste all those. And he did, and he really loved it. And that's how he kind of learned how to make wine. So,
I tasted the 41 Inglenook Reserve, Cask Reserve. I don't remember the cask number, but Cask Reserve maybe 25 years ago, 20 years ago. And, it's a magical wine. I mean, it's a magical wine. And, and the 51 BV Private Georges Latour it's just one of the greatest wines anyone has ever tasted. Certainly one of the greatest wines I've ever tasted. We forget that there is that long history of really, and it's kind of easy to forget that Inglenook used to make some of the greatest wines in the world.
Yes.
Although I think they're trying to do that again with the winemaker from Chateau Margaux joining them.
Absolutely, and I believe they are. They're really trying to rein it in a little bit. As long as, hopefully global warming won't kind of catch up to them too much. But I think they're on a very good track. And that's kind of the pendulum of winemaking, right? Of the wine world. It goes as different critics gain legitimacy and voice, wine styles shift to please their palates. And it's shifting back a little bit. I see that. I've seen that in the last few years. Oh, yep.
You might not be willing to answer this question, but remember, this really isn't public. This is a private event for me and my clients and friends, right? If you had to pick one critic to talk about your wines in publication today, who would that be?
So old school, I'd say, and she might kill me for this, but I'd say Jancis Robinson because she's been following us for years, and for new school, I would say, let's see, who would I say? Galoni, I think, Venice.
Yeah, I thought that's who you would say.
And it's not, and I swear, Hoyt, it's not because they love our wines and stuff. It's just that their palates match what we do. And that's really what wine critics, to me, they're all about. If you find a critic who you agree with, who matches your palate, then you're golden, because they taste so many more wines than you can ever taste. So you can write off their recommendations, and you'll never go wrong if you find one that matches your palate. But you've got to trust your palate, right?
Well, I think they also, they don't have neither of them has a hidden agenda. They're not inflating scores in order to get subscribers, which some people do. They're not trying to imprint their preference for wine on your wines. I think they honestly evaluate the wines and talk about what they experience when they taste them, rather than some critics are championing, one very famous critic, championing a certain style of wine that kind of changed wine in the world for a couple of decades, or maybe 3 decades, where it was pursuit
absolutely
of recognition from one man.
Yes, exactly. And you can't, you can't really fault wineries for chasing scores, because if you're a small winery and you're unknown and you're making a Cabernet from, God forbid, Napa, and you're fighting against 2,500, 3,000, 3,500 other Napa Cabernets, if you can get a high score, you're going to sell out. It's part of the reality of the business. It really is.
Joe Heitz at that event talked about when his 85 Martha's Vineyard Cabernet got 100 points from Wine Spectator. Back then, he didn't have any distribution back then. You had to go to the winery to buy it.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's what he said. I'm not sure it's true, but this is the story he told. Was, you know, and his winery he lived there. It was his house. So he, you know, opened up the door at 8:30 on Wednesday morning or whatever it was. And there were like 500 people standing in line wanting to buy his wine. And it was, I think, $6 a bottle. And he sold a third of his production at $6 a bottle and he let people buy 6 bottles.
Mm-hmm.
And when he sold a third of his production, he raised the price to $12 and told them they could buy 3 bottles. And when he'd sold the next third, he raised the price to $24 and told them they could buy 1 bottle.
Mm-hmm.
And then he stopped when there were still people standing in line wanting to buy the wine when he said, I have to have some left for myself and restaurants, you know, and he just stopped selling it.
Amazing.
I mean, it's such a different world. And, you know,
very much so.
Anyway, so your title is Senior Vice President for Vineyard Operations.
Yes.
Was that Paul's title? Did you replace Paul?
No. Paul was always winemaker. So when Paul was first hired, he was hired as winemaker, and the founding winemaker, Dave Benyon, who had more of an interest in the vineyards, was into the vineyards. Well, Dave Benyon got in an accident, passed away in 1986, and so they had a couple consultants that were kind of helping in the vineyards until they hired me in 1989. So I should also say, though, that our vineyard crew, Rafael Dorado, our foreman, this is 38th vintage, so he's been with it forever. We've got some people that have been in the vineyards for a long time, so they've always done that. But Paul has always been on the winemaking side and involved with growers and stuff. So when they hired me, I was in charge of our estate vineyards, which in 1989 was Monte Bello, about 10% of our production, and now it's about 65% of our production, because we were able to buy Lytton Springs, we were able to lease, and then eventually purchase Geyserville, and of course lease different properties on Monte Bello that have like the Jimson, so we could call them estate vineyards. So it's been and also working with growers like the Pagani Ranch, which is one of the wines, or Ducey, the Ducey family. We've been making that wine since the 80s.
So you've been there. You've been at Ridge for 31 years.
Yes. Yeah.
And how did you manage to hire Richard Olney's nephew to be your winemaker? That, my gosh, that's a brilliant decision.
Yeah. So the wine world is a small world, right? Everybody kind of knows everybody. And John had worked a couple stages in Europe because he decided that he wanted to go into winemaking. So he got his degrees over in Europe and worked for who did he work for? Chave and
You work at Tempier?
He did work at Tempier, and he worked a little bit at Dujac. I believe he did one full season at Dujac. So, and you know, and Jacques Cess is great friends with Paul. They're like, and also Gerard Chave, great friends with Paul. So, Paul did a little research. John had been working at Kermit Lynch, and then he had tried his hand at Foxen down in Santa Barbara County, but he was looking for an internship. So we decided to. Paul did his due diligence and said, "Oh heck yeah! If these people that Paul ran in circles with highly recommended him, and so it was a no-brainer." And by after his internship, he went up to Lytton Springs to oversee basically the building of that winery and the construction building around it, and then it was fantastic. So And so he's been winemaker since believe 2015 is when he was fully promoted from. I mean, he's always been the winemaker. Like Paul said, when Paul retired in 2015, he said that, well, for the last 10 years, that had been John only making half the wines and Eric Bacher making the other half of the wines. So, you know, that we're in really good hands.
We
And
had,
with Eric recently leaving, John's like the head guy now. So it's great. It's been
well,
really good.
he certainly has very good genes. I mean, I know Richard isn't a winemaker, but he certainly, you know, has his place in winemaking history because of Tempier and Chez Panisse and his books. And I actually have his book on Chateau I have his book on Chateau d'Yquem, and it's one of the best books in my library. It's brilliant. You know, we had one of these conversations with Jeremy Sayce recently, and I asked him about his wines, that how do you explain the fact that your best wines are $500 a bottle and DRC's best wines are $6,000 a bottle or more, whatever. And the difference in quality is not all that great. And he just laughed at me. He said, you know, we were there a few months ago and we tasted through their most recent lineup of what vintage, and our wines don't even, he said, you know, they're on a different planet from us. We don't make anything remotely similar to what Aubert de Boulogne, you know, they're close. Obviously, you know, they're very close friends. He said, we don't, what we make has no relevance to what Aubert de Boulogne is making. So, you know.
It's amazing. And that's one thing. Yeah. In Burgundy, it's very, having been there just a few times, but it's incredible how the landscape, those gently sloping hills, and it's like sight is everything. It's everything. California, it's a little bit different in that the climate isn't going to change that much, but soil is still probably the most important part besides climate, besides the temperatures and stuff. And that's where, you know, that's where you can really focus in. If you're looking at site-specific wines, you can really focus in on what makes the wine different. I'm not saying better, I'm just saying different. And if you can tease out the differences and follow that for many years, then you can start to talk about terroir, like Lytton Springs, or like Pagani Ranch, or like Geyserville. I mean, Geyserville, it's almost flat. It's really, really just nondescript, but there's this lens of soil that is Geyserville. And God forbid there are buildings, there's a couple wineries on it. They should just tear everything down and plant it to grapes, Zinfandel, basically, because it's like perfect for that.
So talk to us about the Pagani Ranch Zinfandel, please.
Yeah, so we've been making Pagani Ranch since every year since 1991. And before that, Pagani Ranch had been selling to Sebastiani and a couple other vintners that, and it's a beautiful, beautiful old vineyard. The oldest vines are pre-prohibition. So, and it's kind of like two separate ranches, two different soil types. And the oldest vines are in the back of the ranch from the 1880s, 1890s. And they are on rootstock. Hoyt, but the rootstock that they used in the mid 1880s up until about 1890 or so some of it was St. George, but some of them were direct producers like Lenoir, which is Estivus and Vinifera. It's a hybrid, but it is resistant. Or it's yeah, I'd say resistant to flux, or at least tolerant of it. And then by the early 1890s, everybody was pretty much on St. George in the flats and stuff. So on the highway side, which is probably the most photographed and the most painted vineyard in Sonoma County, is a bunch of Alicante and Zinfandel and Mataro, planted right in the middle of Prohibition, so like 1922, 1924. And these are kind of more solid blocks of, so the Zin is like 90% Zin, the Alicante is 90% Alicante, with other varieties kind of scattered in, including Grand Noir, which is a Tinturier variety, along with Alicante, Mataro, or Mourvedre, and then a little bit of Carignan, but not very much. That's the backbone of Pagani Ranch. And then Dino Amentiti, who's been farming he's fourth generation Pagani, that he's been of the Pagani family. He's been farming it since the late 80s. And he started doing some replanting in around 2010. And so those vines go into it as their quality warrants. And they're a mixed block where we planted every seventh vine is Petit Syrah. And then the rest are different heritage clones of Zinfandel. So that's kind of Pagani. It's a cool spot. It's in a little hole between Glen Ellen and Kenwood, and it gets ripe usually fairly late. Very exotic fruit, very fruit forward, great acidity, and you can taste the Alicante in there. It really, really does it. I think it really thickens the mid palate just enough without adding any more structure to the finish. So I love this wine. I think it's one of my favorites. My oldest brother's favorite wine. It's very exuberant.
I I understand that there's a treatise at UC Davis talking about roots, and it suggests, so when after phylloxera and after Prohibition, when correct me, I'm going to say something that's probably stupid and wrong, and you can feel free to correct me. I've got a thick skin. After phylloxera and Prohibition, people started planting grapes. The great motivation, as it was in a lot of places, was yield, because there wasn't really that much thought of making extraordinary wine. It's let's make a lot of wine. And the RX7 rootstock was the most prolific rootstock. You would get the greatest tonnage per acre. And so a lot of the vineyards that were planted then were grafted to or planted with that rootstock in an attempt to create economic success, as opposed to trying to create extraordinary wine. But nobody planted Zinfandel because Zinfandel wasn't fashionable back then. But what I've heard is there's a treatise at UC Davis that suggests RX7 rootstock, but the last sentence of the treatise is one caveat: it is not resistant to phylloxera, and St. George roots are. And that, so then when maybe Gary Pizzoni brought cuttings back from Latache and Montrachet and introduced a new strain of phylloxera to Northern California, if that's the truth, who knows? Some people have said that the vines then weren't resistant to this new strain of phylloxera, and it was kind of apocalyptic. But the Zinfandel vines, they were all 100 years old, and as you said earlier, on St. George roots, so they were resistant, and they weren't killed.
Yeah, so
That's
pretty good. That's pretty good. Yeah, it's really good. So there's the rootstock AXR it's Aramon, which is a vinifera variety, and Rupestris, which is one of the parent wild types of grapes from Texas that is actually in St. George. It's very drought resistant, and so AXR was a beautiful rootstock. It grafted really well because it was half vinifera. You could get 95% take or more when you were so nurserymen loved it. The wine quality actually was pretty good. Yields were good, and wine quality could be very good with it. They loved it in Europe too for a hot minute, and within 10 years of because that's where it was first bred, in southern France. But after about 10 years, phylloxera, which because Europe, especially in Europe, they get enough rain in the summer, which California doesn't. Phylloxera can fly if there's enough humidity, and so they can do sexual reproduction. So there's a lot more biotypes of phylloxera. After 10 years, AXR failed in Europe, so it was never recommended. When it first came over to the rootstocks came over to California, which was at the same time well, no, I shouldn't say about 10 or 15 years after they were really working in Europe, they didn't really recommend AXR. They recommended St. George. Well, then when but they planted a lot of different rootstocks, some of which we're still using today. AXR showed really well in California because that biotype of phylloxera that could attack it was non-existent. But they always said it at some point it will mutate and it will fail. The phylloxera will mutate and AXR will fail. But as generations went by, people forgot about that, and people planted it because, like I say, it was economically worked out well for everybody. But it did fail, and when it failed, it was catastrophic. I mean, you look at Napa. I was in Napa in the early and mid '80s before I came to Ridge, and it was just starting to fail then, and it was I kind of got a little bit of a sense of what they were dealing with in Europe when phylloxera came in. It's like you had these beautiful, healthy, productive vineyards, and in 3 years they were dead, and you could baby them along for a little bit, but I mean it was devastating. And you can criticize the industry for jumping on AXR and planting it too much, but again, they did it because it worked out really well. There was no need to change, and it hit virus really well too, which the other rootstocks don't. They will show virus if you have it, and the vines you'll get less quality, and vines will fail. And UC Davis didn't do, they followed their public universities. They followed public money. They didn't research enough of what they should have either. So you can blame both parties, but the net result of it after a lot of replanting is that we're understanding more about clones. We're understanding a lot more about rootstocks, and we're understanding the necessity of trying to get clean budwood because of the interactions. And by clean budwood, I mean, that's grapevines are asexually propagated, vegetatively propagated. So you always accumulate virus, and you see that across the world. There's a tulip craze back in 150 years ago, and basically you could make a fortune trading tulip bulbs that had viruses that eventually killed the tulips. I mean, it was just ridiculous. But that's viruses, and grapevines kind of do the same thing. So we could talk about that for a lot. But yes, you're right. The old Zinfandel vineyards pre-prohibition, they weren't on AXR. Otherwise, they would be failing. So
one other, there's two other points. One other factor that I think contributed was the first time I visited Napa or Northern California, the wine country, is you drove north from San Francisco and you kind of got to the, Napa. You would see a vineyard, and then you'd see an olive grove, and then you'd see a truck farm, and then you might see a wheat field. I don't remember wheat field, but some other kind of agriculture. And then you'd see another vineyard. But now, I mean, you mentioned monovarietal. Now, Northern California is a monoculture almost. And so when phylloxera was introduced by somebody on their shoes or something, it was like Sherman marching to Atlanta. I mean, it was just, there was no break. There was nothing to stop it because one vineyard ended and another vineyard began a meter away or something.
Well, and not only that, Hoyt, that's very true. And the other thing that really contributes to it, and it contributes to spread of other exotic pests today, is that I'd say 60-70% of the vineyards in Napa and Sonoma County are farmed by farm management companies, vineyard management companies. They always have more than one client. A typical Napa Valley vineyard management company farms from the Carneros through Calistoga and sometimes over into Alexander Valley or Knights Valley. So they're moving equipment and people all the time. And that also contributes very much to it.
I just think of,
mud on shoes. Exactly.
That's
boots, it. It's as simple as that.
It's that simple. But however, would you agree that average wine quality in California today is greatly improved because of phylloxera?
Absolutely. I would say yes, because of Fluxer, because of better viticultural techniques, because of more interest in clones, because of not tolerating a vineyard that gives mediocre or moderate quality because the yields are really high. Now you can get high yields and high quality if that's what you really want. So yes, absolutely. And the other thing is the whole worldwide wine competition keeps getting better and better. So if you don't keep up, you fall behind. And that's where, and that's where California is in pretty good stead because we have a lot of knowledgeable people. We have a lot of technology. We also have very high land costs and high labor costs that some other parts of the world don't. But I think we can compete fairly well, and we have a great domestic market, right? I mean, that's really important.
Gaia talked about when her father first started making wine in Bulgaria, that, that he wasn't all that excited about the wines they were making, with good reason. They weren't exciting. And then it took him a few years to realize that not everywhere in Tuscany is the best place for Sangiovese. Some places in Bulgaria,
Exactly.
it's the best place for Merlot or Petit Verdot or Cabernet Franc. And then all of a sudden, he's making these amazing wines like Magari and Promise, those wines. So Phylloxera gave California the opportunity to plant the right grape in the right place instead of just everything being Cabernet and Chardonnay.
Exactly right. And I think that, and the other thing that I see that's really changing in the last 15 or so years is that wine, especially with millennials and stuff, they're more adventurous, right? They don't necessarily have to have their buttery Chardonnay or their big heavy Cabernet, right? They will try other wines, and so it's opened up a whole. And there are also some great winemakers that are going out and looking at, well, I don't want to just do this or that. I want to try something else. So they're looking at some really neat more varietals and more wine styles. And the big heavy Cabernets, that there's still going to be a place for that, but I think it's actually kind of calming down a little bit. Sorry for my dog. He's
I was going to ask you, what's your dog's name?
Oscar. He's a little Bichon, and he gets grumpy when people drive by the house, I guess.
Is he as stubborn as my Bichon?
Oh, you have a Bichon too? Yes, they have a great personality, don't they? They're amazing. Yeah.
He's 20 years old.
Oh my God, that gives me hope. Oscar just turned 9, so
he's
awesome.
20 years old. He's he's not very active, but he's still alive. He is such
awesome.
One time we were having a dinner party, and it was close friends, so everybody fixed their plate in the kitchen and went in the dining room to eat. And one of our friends said, "I think it smells like something is on fire." Robbie, our Bichon, we knew we had pushed the chairs into the table so he couldn't get up on the table, because he would get up on the table if you allowed him to. Somehow he'd gotten up on the table and was trying to get the napkin off the bread so he could eat it. And both of his ears and his tail were on fire. And he was oblivious to the fact that he was on fire in 3 places. He didn't care. He was going to get that bread. But he's still alive at 20 years.
You wanted the bread.
And what's your dog's name? Ozzy.
Oh, that's amazing. That's awesome.
Ozzy. Well,
Oscar.
Oscar.
Well.
Oscar.
No, Oscar. Oscar. Yeah.
Oscar. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. What a great.
So how did you prepare? Yeah. How did you prepare for this? I just can't. I don't know what the equivalent wine store would be to be the wine director of, to being the senior vice president for vineyard management at Ridge, maybe Zacky's. So if I got hired to be the wine director, I'm not going to be, because Stu does a great job, but if I were, I would be really, really panicked. I mean, that's a intimidating job to be offered. How have you prepared to be in this position at a winery like Ridge?
So, it's all about being in the right place at the right time. So the only reason why my wife and I came down here is from Napa, is that she got accepted to a PhD program at Stanford. And so a friend of mine was working at Cinnabar and said, well, I think Ridge is looking for a vineyard manager, because they had never hired their own vineyard manager. They just used either Dave Benyon or a consultant. And so, um, I interviewed for the job. They hadn't talked with anyone yet that had, um, you know, a bit of experience in vineyard management, and I got along fine with Paul, and that's really what mattered. In fact, my interview consisted of talking with Paul and Wilma Sturrock, who was our president at the time, and just about grapes and wine, a little bit about wine, and then we went over, and one of the people on the staff was having a birthday party, so we had lunch and cake. And then they called me back a little bit later and offered me the job. So it was like it's ignorance is bliss, right? It was a great interview. I think it's because Paul, I guess I said enough of the right things or whatever, that Paul trusted me. And then we really started looking at how to improve a little bit on how the grapes are grown at Monte Bello, and then also working with the growers. So, and that's where we really started to ramp up our involvement with our growers, because he couldn't do it all. He didn't have the time or bandwidth to do it all. So, and that worked out, I think, really well.
You would have been in your in your 20s?
I just turned 30. So yeah. And my wife
Well,
and I
you're not as much younger than as I thought then.
Yeah. But my wife and I kind of said, well, how long does it take to get a PhD? 5 years, maybe, something like that. So we figured we'd be moving on from then, and this will be my 33rd vintage. So it's kind of neat when I.
And what was her PhD in?
Counseling psychology. So she teaches at San Jose State. So it's worked out really well.
You mentioned the Chardonnay a few minutes ago.
Yes.
And I know Chardonnay kind of probably gets lost when people think about Ridge wines. Don't be tempted by the idea of not making Monte Bello Chardonnay anymore.
No, don't worry, Hoyt. It's a wine along with Monte Bello that we've made every year since the Ridge was founded. So it's something that we'll always do. And the Santa Cruz Mountains is a really great spot for Chardonnay. It's a versatile grape, and here it shows its sunny side, so it shows the ripe fruit that you expect from California, but there's always this great backbone of acidity that helps keep it fresh, in my opinion. And it ages beautifully too. If you like older, if you like 10-year-old Burgundies, you'll love 10-year-old Chardonnays from the Santa Cruz Mountains. Not just Ridge, there are other producers that are doing a very good job too.
Well, I've tasted quite a few vintages of it, and it deserves more recognition perhaps than it gets, because it just gets, when you think of Ridge, you think of Geyserville, Lytton Springs, Monte Bello, and it's, it would be far down the list probably in a lot of people's eyes, but it's, in some vintages, is a truly extraordinary wine. So we should talk about the Lytton Springs.
Lytton Springs, yes. Yeah. So this wine, Dry Creek Valley, right? It shows, to me, it shows all the attributes of why Dry Creek Valley is rightly known as a great spot on the earth for Zinfandel. To me, it has the more blackberry type of fruit with on the Zinfandel side. So kind of right in the center, the sweet spot of the core fruit. It always has this to me, it's like if you're picking blackberries on a July afternoon, the sun's beating down on you, so you've got the blackberry aroma, and you're eating a few of them too, right? But you also, the Himalaya blackberries that we have here have really sharp thorns, so you always scratch yourself a little bit. So there's a hint of blood in the air too, that mineral. That's what I think of with Lytton Springs, especially when it's about 5 to 10 years old. It really comes out in that. the tannins on Lytton Springs are always, it's a more broad-shouldered wine. So and that's because it's got quite a bit of Petit Syrah in it. But it's also the site that it's grown on, the clay soils at Lytton. We have like 5 different soil types there that they really make the vine struggle, and it changes the pH of the wine. It makes it a little higher pH, and it changes the expression of the tannins. So John is actually really careful on extracting tannins on this wine, and yet it still has good structure for a Zinfandel. And always a really long finish. And on the younger wines, we always say decant, double decant,
Yeah.
whatever you can do to help wake it up, open it up.
Or just open it, put the cork back in and wait 4 or 5 days.
That too, that does the same thing. Absolutely. Yeah.
What do you think the prime drinking window for Lytton, for a superb quality vintage like 2018 of Lytton Springs? Is it 6-7 years?
Yeah, I would say up to 10 years. But it depends on how you like your wines, right? If you like them, if you like them really fresh and young with a a big steak or something, then you want to stay 5 years or earlier. If you like them, the 18, if you like older wines, it'll age beautifully. It'll go out 20 years, I'm sure. But you lose the primary fruit. But old Zinfandels, they always have this core of sweet, beautiful fruit that, especially in a good vintage like this, you're talking about 73 Lytton, 74 Geyserville, they're still beautiful today. I mean, and the 99 is going to be the same era, I think. And maybe the 85. The 85 is I think the 85 in Zinfandels is better than the 85 in Monte Bello. That 84 is starting to outshine by. But anyway, that's a whole nother thing. So
Well,
if you
I
like
remember
them old, you can.
I do remember the 84 Monte Bello from Jeroboam. I mean, it was honestly, a miraculous wine. I guess it was close to 20 years old in a Jeroboam from Marvin's cellar, so it would have been stored very cool, stored well.
Wow.
And the 73 Geyserville would have been, almost 30 years old.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't the least bit tired.
Yeah, there was a stretch, and we've had them in the 90s since I've been at Ridge. We've had them in the 90s, the middle of the aughts, and the teens have all been like the 70s, kind of magical years. Each one different, but each one really wonderful in and of itself. And I think they will age beautifully. But given that, though, Zinfandel is still kind of, I think it shows itself better in the first 10 years or so. It's like Don Reason, our late president, said, Zinfandel is something that you drink while you're waiting for your Monte Bello to mature, for your Cabernet to mature. That's a Don Reasonism.
If you're disciplined enough to wait for the Monte Bello to mature, which
yes,
a lot of us
you
are
have
not.
to be, yes, exactly.
The winery at Lytton Springs is really special. And I think you were responsible for that project. Can you talk about that?
No, not me. That was John Olney. He was up there and he oversaw the construction of it, but it was Paul's idea. So any of you that have visited our winery at Monte Bello, and please, if you haven't, come and do it, or at Lytton Springs, but at Monte Bello, it was built before Prohibition, and it was kind of tucked into a ravine. So on 3 sides, it's surrounded by rock, limestone rock, and with water kind of coming down from the top side down to the bottom. So it's kept naturally cool by the rock walls and dug into the earth. What we wanted when we were finally decided to build a winery, replace the winery that we had at Lytton Springs, because our Zinfandel production, we wanted a place on site that could take the majority of our Zinfandel production up there. Paul wanted to do a cave, go down into the earth so that we could spend less on cooling it and also keep it a better temperature. And it's better that way. But it's not called Lytton Springs for a reason. It's full of water and full of springs. So you couldn't really dig down and do that because it's in the springtime, all winter and spring, it's just too much water. So what he decided was to try to do like an above ground cave, and that's where we made it. It's post and beam construction, but the infill is all rice straw. And back in the late 80s late 90s, early 2000s, that was there weren't many people doing that. In fact, it was like one of the biggest straw building in California for quite a while. And so we basically had to teach the building department in Sonoma County what we were doing and how we were doing it. And it's held up beautifully. I was very skeptical, especially on the interior walls, because it's basically just whitewash. It's stucco. The stucco is made. So let me back up. It's rice straw, which has high silica content. In California, we grow a lot of rice, and they would always burn the rice straw. And now we're finding better things to do with it. I use it in the vineyards for erosion control. Back then, but it's really good building material because the silica in it keeps insects from eating on it. If you can keep it dry, it'll last forever. And so you put mesh on it, and then you use a stucco over it. And the stucco was rice straw, again, chopped up very fine, sand, and then soil, high clay soil from our vineyard at Lytton Springs. And so we mixed that all together, and you put several skip coats of it on. And then the final coat was, or a couple coats were very thin coat of that a lot, but instead of using water to bind it all together, it was linseed oil. And that's held up really well on the outside, as long as you protect it from driving rain. On the inside, they put 7 coats of whitewash. So it's basically plaster of Paris, but very thin. Just the quicklime put on it. And then the last 3 coats of that were colored with a little bit of soil. So it has this kind of reddish soil. And I was very skeptical of that because it's interior, it's humid because you want high humidity where you're keeping your barrels, and it's held up beautifully. It's amazing. It's the only issue we've had are northern flickers, which is a woodpecker that we have up here. Tried to nest in a couple corners of the winery building, and instead of shooting it, I put a box up where it was trying to nest, a nesting box, and so it went in there and nested instead of trying to burrow into the winery building. But otherwise, it's been great.
Is that a common building method there?
Not at all. No, not at all. No, as far as I know, no other wineries have done it. There have been some vineyards and wineries that use it for outbuildings, like Tablas Creek has several of them where they build them around their pump houses and stuff, or their equipment shed, because it's cheap, relatively cheap to build that way, and it's very ecological. It's a great way to go.
And when did you build the winery?
So we started in, I think, 1998 or 1999, and it took a few years because we had to we had this tin building that had the existing winery. First, we built around it on 3 sides of straw bales, and then we tore that down and then built refilled where the tank room is. We did that like 2 years later, a year later. Had to do it in stages because we were still making wine there. So John was good at juggling things around. He's got a great video of our blending tank getting craned up and over into the facility, which it's pretty impressive.
So it's almost 20 years old. So if it wasn't viable, you would know it.
Yeah, come visit.
Right? You said it's held up well.
Oh, for sure. We had an issue with the roof, but it's held up beautifully. We had an issue with the roof, but that was underneath the roof, and that was a design issue or problem that the engineer and the roofing contractor and the general contractor were all pointing fingers at each other. They just didn't get the humidity in it correctly. So, but that's fixed now, and it's bulletproof, and the roof is strong enough to put some solar on it. So it's been really good.
Talk about, if you would, talk a little bit about this idea of pre-industrial winemaking.
Yeah, so there are there are some people that have written blogs on this that are of course, much more articulate than I am. But if you look at the regs, the regulations from the Bureau of Tobacco and Alcohol, the TTB, there are many additives that you can put into wine to help. You can do anywhere from enzymes that help break down um, some of the phenols to actually adding wood as you ferment to some pretty nasty stuff in my opinion. Anyway, there's some additives in there that most of them they're all food grade because it's a beverage, right? But there are things that really kind of manipulate the wine that hopefully you don't have to do. Um, some And I would say that some of the more industrial wineries, the ones that have to turn their tanks in 5 days or whatever, when they're, if they have or they ferment in huge containers because they have to, that's the way they can make a $10 bottle of wine or a $5 bottle of wine. They need to use some of those techniques to clarify the wine or to speed the process along. And so I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying that we choose not to do that. And so when Paul says pre-industrial, when we say pre-industrial, it's like if you look at the last century, not the 1900s, but the 1800s, the techniques that they had perfected by the end of the 1800s were techniques that they had used for millennia, thousands of years, that they had been able to get a little bit better as they learn more about what a bacteria is, what a yeast is. And so it's basically, making sure that the wine is clear, using a little bit of sulfites so that you can keep the wine from going bad, and doing everything you can to keep the wine stable without jumping in and really manipulating it. So not adding acid unless you have to make sure that it's stable, that the wine remains stable, not not messing with it to the least amount as possible. You can't just crush it and have it make wine, because it would turn into vinegar really quickly. But you can shepherd that and try to do the minimal amount to it. And when he says minimal intervention, but maximum observation, you really need to, if you're playing on that edge, you really have to watch it. It's, you can talk about natural winemaking and all of that. You can get away with it on some wines, but some wines you can't. And so you just have to really watch how the wine is progressing. And if you need to jump in, you jump in. Like if a Brettanomyces is a spoilage yeast that can take sugars that normal yeast or VCA can't consume, and it can do that. Well, that's fine, but it can do a little bit of an off flavor, especially if it happens when it's in the bottle. So we make very sure that we don't have any Brettanomyces that's going into the bottle as we bottle the wine, stuff like that. And it's not that we don't filter our wines. We do of course filtration, but we say that, we have anything that we put do to the wine, we say on our tech sheets or on our label. In fact, that's one thing that Paul had pushed for quite a bit. Ronald Graham started it many years ago and then kind of went away from it from Bonnie Doon, right? Putting ingredient labeling. So on all of our wines since, I don't know, 2015 or so, we put whatever we've done to that wine, whatever's in that wine, we put on the label. And that's just to show that that we don't have anything to hide. And in fact, there's one procedure that I don't know if I'm sure you know about it, reverse osmosis. You can use that to remove alcohol from wine. You can use it to remove volatile acidity to the wine. Well, one year we had some Petit Syrah from York Creek, and it had gone volatile on it. So it was over the legal limit. So we couldn't call it wine. I mean, you didn't want it either. So what we ended up doing with that is we did a trial. It was Zinfandel, sorry, not Petit Syrah. We did a reverse osmosis on it, and there you can blend back some of the wine so that you get it to taste really good. And it was a nice wine, but it didn't taste like York Creek anymore. So we called it Spring Mountain, Zinfandel, and we put on it that these grapes came from York Creek, but we did a reverse osmosis on it. We did a procedure on it called reverse osmosis to remove volatile acidity. And it was a beautiful wine. It didn't age like the York Creek that we hadn't done that with. But more importantly for us, it didn't taste like York Creek. So that's why we ended up.
David, can we stop?
Yes.
Can we stop for just a second? Would you give me just a second?
You bet.
So sorry. I had something that needed immediate attention.
Oh yeah, so did my dog. He wanted to play.
Well, your immediate attention is more important than mine.
He's bored.
You were talking about pre-industrial winemaking.
Yeah, I hope I wasn't ranting too much, but that's for us. It's really important because there are lots of different ways to make wine. We choose to really showcase what the vineyard gives us, and not to try to work the wine too much. And if you have really great sites, and a good year, then you don't really need to do that. You don't need to add too many things to the wine.
Years ago, I had at the same restaurant where Paul hosted the dinner with me, I had a lunchtime tasting with Randall Graham, who of course was famously known as the Rhone Ranger. So I actually had Randall dressed as the Lone Ranger ride into the restaurant on a horse. And fortunately, the horse was well behaved. He poured.
Was Randall? That's more important.
Well, and he poured Cigar Volant from Double Magnum from the back of the horse for my friends and customers.
Oh, that's amazing!
In the bar at the restaurant.
That's perfect.
So I don't know what your equivalent of horseback is. If you're ever in the Twin Cities and we can have a tasting together, maybe we'll just let you walk in with a
that'd be great.
Magnum of something.
Yeah, try to drive my Jeep up there, but that wouldn't.
Well, Randall was very good. He had a good sense of humor, to say the least.
Yes, he's great.
Is he still alive?
Yes, he is. He's at his place in San Juan Bautista, and he's growing some grapes there. Some what does he have? He has I gave him some Bec Noir Budwood, which is a obscure variety from the Jura that we found in Geyserville. We found a few vines of that planted in a mixed planting at Geyserville, and he's got a couple other. I think he's got some. What else does he have? Manseng, Petit Manseng, and a couple others. Wow. Yeah, he's doing some great stuff. So
he was trying to make great Chenin Blanc for a while, right? He was going to be the next Huet.
Yes, but now it's more Grenache or Offspring. So he's done a lot of plant breeding, and he's going to see if he can get some 1 or 2 or 3 new varieties out of that. So,
well, if you speak to him, remind him that he rode into my restaurant on horseback.
I will. He'll love it. I'm sure he remembers it very well.
Probably the late 80s, I would guess.
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah, awesome.
We had one of these tastings with a South African winemaker named Eben Sadi, who makes he's nobody's ever heard of him, and he makes some of the most incredible wines I've tasted in the last few years. And he talked about attention to detail, which how sharp the blades on the secateurs are is really important. How the workers are dressed when they arrive at work in the morning is really important. That there is no detail that's too small to be important if you're going to be a non-interventionist winemaker and allow the vineyard and grapes to express themselves in the bottle. That I hear that again resonating in what you're saying and what I know what Paul's philosophy was.
Yeah.
Is there? I feel like one of the reasons people are enamored of quote natural wines these days is they're afraid of sulfur dioxide in the wines. Because I can't really figure out what otherwise, why I just don't get it. But is there a reason for the consumer to be worried about SO2 in the wine? Is there any health
So
consequence from SO2?
it depends, I would say, on the levels of SO2 in wine. No, unless you're extremely sensitive to it, and the it's very, very rare that a person is sensitive enough to sulfur dioxide that you would pick up the 100 or less, or well, between 70 and 150 parts per million total SO2 that's in a wine. Most of that's bound up anyway. It's very little of that that's actually active. So sulfur dioxide, don't get me wrong, it's a poison, right? If you inhale it, it could really do serious damage. But it's in such small quantities that it isn't. If someone's getting a headache from wine, it's I would say 99 times out of 100, it's not because of the amount of sulfites in the wine. It's something else that had been in the wine, or the quantity of wine that they drank. I'm not sure, but
I think headaches are caused by alcohol.
well, there you go. Yeah, I mean that's
My experience.
yes. Well, alcoholism too, right?
I read something, I don't know, 10 years ago or 12 years ago, that there is 1%, no, 1/10 of 1% of people that have a certain kind of diabetes, which is almost no one in the world, is allergic to sulfites. And the rest of the world, there are no health consequences from sulfites.
Yes.
But, Fetzer in I guess the 80s said Bonterra didn't contain sulfites, so you wouldn't have a headache the next day. And everybody believed them. And the Bonterra wines did contain sulfites, and sulfites don't cause headaches. But, once it's said in public, things gain traction, and all these years later, people are still worried.
Yes, and I would worry. Well, the main thing for me is just try the wines, right? We feel like the small amount, the sulfites that we just added as needed, and we keep our free sulfur, free SO2, which actually is what does the work, keeps the wine safe from microbes. We keep it at very small levels, the very minimum needed to keep the wine safe, and that's what we've always done, and we feel that that's the only way that we can ensure that the wine will be good in when you open it, whether that's the next day or that evening or 30 years from now. That's kind of how we feel.
One day, Dr. Phil said that if you have gluten issues, you need to be careful about what wines you drink. And the next day, every single person that walked in the door of my store in Nashville asked me where our gluten-free wines were. Mm-hmm. And when I would try to explain them the truth, they thought I was lying, and Dr. Phil was telling the truth.
Yes.
So
exactly.
after about a week and a half of this, I put up a big sign across the back wall of the store saying, "We specialize in gluten-free wine. Every wine in the store is gluten-free." Because it was true.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my God.
Because then people believed me because it was in writing.
Yes, there you go.
So tell us about the Lytton Estate Petit Syrah.
Yeah, so Ridge has been making Petit Syrah in various forms since 1970. So it's always been part of our portfolio. The first one actually was, I think, from the Palisades in Napa, and then of course, in '71 we started making Petit Syrah from York Creek, and for many years up until 2015 or 2016, and we find that, well, and also I should say that Petit Syrah is part of the historic mix in vineyards such as Lytton Springs. What we found with the Lytton Petit Syrah that's grown at Lytton Springs and Dry Creek is makes a really nice wine on its own, also with a blend. And Petit Syrah is really good in Zinfandel blend because it has this big mid palate and pretty good substantial tannins. So it can cover the mid palate for Zinfandels if they tend to be a little bit thin there, and it can also help with the finish. the Petit Syrah at Lytton makes a wine that is pretty easy on its own to make and taste. And I say that because it doesn't necessarily need 10 or 15 or 20 years like some of those older Petit Syrah York Creeks that live forever. They needed 10 or 15 years to actually be drinkable because the tannins were so tough. The Lytton Springs, the Petit Syrah grown at Lytton Springs isn't that way. It still has substantial tannins, as you can tell in this wine, and but they're covered with this velvetyness, and it does age beautifully. The O2 that we made has been drinking fine for a decade, and will go on for another decade at least. But it can be approachable when it's young, depending on how I never drink it unless it's 10 years old, but that's just my palate. And I have the luxury of being able to wait that long. But we love it. And it's funny because John he will ferment these very fast on the skins. They're only on the skins for between 3 and 5 days, depending on the year. So when you press them off the skins, there's still a lot of sugar. The good thing about Petit Syrah, it's a little bit like Pinot Noir, is that yeast love it. So they chew up the sugar really quickly. So, but the tannins, you have to really watch so that you don't extract too much tannin. And that's why he pulls it off so soon, before the alcohol gets so high that it starts to take the seed tannins or too much of the skin tannin.
Well, I think you're spot on in suggesting that we taste it third in the lineup. It's
Yes. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
massive
Yeah.
wine.
Because yes, it is. It's deceptively massive, right? I mean, and the Lytton Springs has a lot of tannin. It's got, I mean, that's a very big wine. And then you taste the Petit Syrah, and it's like, holy smokes. It just fills your mouth.
On your website, John talks about the peppery notes in this wine that come, he says, from the Syrah family of grapes. Is Petit Syrah and Syrah, are Petit Syrah and Syrah actually related?
Yes.
Enologically?
Yeah, absolutely. Petit Syrah is an offspring of Syrah. So there's a fellow named. Sorry about that, Hoyt. Somebody rang the doorbell.
It doesn't bother me at all. My dog lives with my ex-wife, so I miss him a lot, but I'm very used to that bark. I've heard that.
Recognize that bark? Yeah. So there's a professor of viticulture or a grape breeder in the south of France named Henri Durif, Durif. And in the 1880s, he made a cross between Pelersan and Syrah, and he called it Durif after himself. It never caught on in Europe, but it came to the New World. And in the New World, it got the name morphed to Petit Syrah, and it was grown in I would say mixed vineyards, of course, because back in the 1880s, that's what they did. But it had a couple different names, but Petit Syrah is the name that stuck. Some of the oldest vineyards that you'd see would have all three varieties. It'd be mostly Petit Syrah, but you'd always find a few Pelersan vines, and then you'd always find a few Syrah vines interplanted. If you look at, so you know how Syrah tastes, smooth, big tannins, but smooth, right? And a little more floral, and it does have some pepper. If you taste a Pelersan vine, and you see them all over, a few vines here and there in old vineyards. They're bushy. Their grapes are bigger than strawberries, so that's why Petit Syrah berries are a little bit bigger. The tannins on them are just nasty. I mean, it's just, if you made a Pelersan wine, it would not be pleasant. They're bitter, and when you chew them at harvest, it just numbs your mouth. They're so bitter. And if you look at Petit Syrah, the amount of tannin it has is like halfway in between Syrah and Pelersan. So it's a direct offspring of Syrah. That's a long story to say yes, you're right.
Who are the great Petit Syrah producers other than Ridge?
Oh gosh,
Stag's Leap?
Faupion, Stag's Leap has been doing a great job with it in Napa. There's a little Elysian makes one from York Creek that's been really well received. There's an old school version. The Fopiano family has made it
Oh,
for
yeah.
several generations.
Yeah.
In Russian River, does a great job. And there's an outfit, a nonprofit called Petit Sera I Love You, that used to have annual tastings, and there's they have a big list of producers. Trentadue Winery makes one that can be really nice.
Well, and Relentless has some, Schaefer Relentless is Syrah and Petit
It is.
Syrah,
I
right?
believe it's about a third. I think it's about a third to 40% Petit Syrah. Yes, that's right. Yep. Yep.
So I'm sure you're aware that your 2018's got very, very high scores from everyone.
Yes.
Do you think they're the best wines made at Ridge?
I don't know. No, I mean, I think we make wines to please every palate. And that's, to me, it's like scores are great. This is another Don Reasonism, because he was before president, he was our head of sales. He says, he would say to us in production, he'd say, just give me one good score. One from a critic. He said, I don't care if it's Joe down the street that has his little wine blog or whatever, but just give one good score, because when you're selling, when wine shops are selling, some wine shops, not all wine shops, when some wine shops are selling, or grocery stores are selling wine, a score, people love scores. So the higher the score, the better. It helps. And some people, that's how they sell their wines, based on scores. So for me, scores are relative, and I don't care. To me, it's what the wine tastes like, and does it please somebody. If it pleases somebody, then I'm happy with it. And scores are relative. It seems like it's really hard to get higher than higher than mid 90s for a Zinfandel, where it's easy to get higher than mid 90s with a Cabernet. I'm saying easy, it's not, but you know what I mean? It's all relative. So I don't put a lot of stock in them. I say, does the wine taste good? Does it serve the purpose that you're using it for? And if it ticks the box, then I don't care what the score is. In fact, one of our better Cabernets, Monte Bello's I think it got an 85 or 83 or whatever from the Wine Spectator. This is many years ago. And it was great, because, I mean, we laughed all the way to the bank, because everybody kept buying it. It didn't matter, because the people that bought it didn't care what the score was. They knew the wine and they followed it.
I was the sommelier at a dinner a few years ago with Jim Clendenin, where we served 3 vintages of one of his Chardonnays, including the 1980, and 3 vintages of one of his Pinot Noirs, and along with Merceau Perrier from Dominique Lafon and Santenay-le-Gravier from Dominique Lafon. The best wine of the tasting easily was the 1980 Pinot Noir La Beaujolais des, no, I'm sorry, the 1980 Chardonnay.
Mm-hmm.
That got the lowest score in the history of Wine Spectator. It got 50 when it was released. They gave it 51 points. It's the lowest score they've ever given a wine.
That's just crazy.
And at 30 plus years old, it was absolutely in very intimidating company, right?
Mm-hmm.
Lafon Merceau Perrier sells for 10 times what Jim's Chardonnay does, or more.
Mm-hmm.
It was the best wine, easily the best wine. I mean, it wasn't even debatable. It was the best wine of the day. And his 1980 Pinot Noir La Beaujolais des was the best red wine of the day in very, very high cotton competition.
Yeah, and as I recall, 1980, that wasn't a great vintage in the north coast of California. It was obviously much better in Santa Barbara, so that's awesome.
Well, Jim's a kind of a magician, as
yes, he is.
And it's you think about at that time, his style of winemaking was so not understood, because at that time Chardonnay from California was oaky,
Mm-hmm.
really oaky, and his wines were really not oaky.
Yes, exactly.
And if it had been more oaky, it wouldn't have lasted that long. It would have fallen apart at 10 years old, instead of been singing at 30 years. Well, I've taken up the hour and a half of your time that you promised us, and it's been fantastic. I would like to ask you one more question. It's a question I ask at
Yes.
the end of every one of these, if
Uh-huh.
you don't mind.
No problem, Hoyt.
And
This is fun.
I'm not asking you what's the best wine you've ever tasted. That's too easy. I would
Uh-oh.
ask you, what's the greatest wine experience of your life?
Okay, Hoyt,
The
could you
most memorable
repeat
wine
that?
experience.
Oh, great. Yeah, you kind of blanked out a little. So, oh my God, for me, I'd have to say it was, oh God, a long time ago, 1991. We were sitting at the back of a restaurant in Burgundy with Christophe Marin, who was the wine director or wine vineyard guy for Domaine Dujac. First time that my wife and I had been to Europe, and he took us out to this restaurant. Of course, it was in their village in Moray Saint Denis, and we had a 76 Echezot and a 78 Clos de la Roche, and that was the first time that I had a slightly older Burgundy that was, really nice wine. But it wasn't just that. It was the company. We're sitting on a long table under a willow tree. The food was spectacular, and the wine just kind of flowed with that, and it was marvelous. And the other thing I remember was that at the end of the meal, you get the espressos, right? And Christoph was stealing everybody's sugars because he must have put, like, I don't know, five cubes of sugar in his espresso. It's just crazy. But the wines were amazing, and that's when I thought, oh my God, this is really fun, and this is a life that I get to be part of. It's pretty spectacular, pretty neat.
That was 10 years into your career at Ridge.
No, just a couple years into.
Oh, 89.
Ridge,
That's right. Just a couple of years.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, no, it was marvelous, and since then, another experience was when Paul decided to retire. We were in New York, and Antonio Galloni, but we were pouring the 71 Monte Bello, and Antonio Galloni brought from his cellar the 70 Monte Bello, which was the second time I'd ever tasted that, and that was a marvelous wine. That's a wine that Paul said if Stephen Spurrier had chosen the 70 Monte Bello instead of the 71 for the Judgment of Paris tasting, and this is Paul being not necessarily modest, but he said if Spurrier had chosen the 70 instead of the 71, the Monte Bello would have won the first Paris tasting, the 10th year anniversary, the 30th, because that wine is amazing. And that was his second vintage of Monte Bello, the first vintage that he was fully in charge of. And it's like this magical wine. It's unbelievable.
We had one of these conversations with Thomas Keller early on, one of the first ones we did. And he and I have been friends for a long time. His last job before he opened the French Laundry was at our restaurant in Nashville.
Oh, fantastic.
So, my epitaph is going to be last person to sign Thomas Keller's paycheck. But I asked him, because, he's not a wine guy, he's a chef. I asked him, pick 3 wines that you'd like to taste in this, hour and a half conversation. And he picked Geyserville, Lytton Springs, and Turley Estate Zinfandel were the 3 wines. He loves Zinfandel. And of course, he and Paul are close friends, and Larry Turley's an investor in the French Laundry. But I'd say that you should put that somewhere on your website, that given his chance of tasting any 3 wines in the world, 2 of them were Ridge Zinfandels.
That's awesome. I will do that. That's incredible.
But when I want to tell you this, I know this isn't, I don't think this is your area of responsibility. I do spend quite a bit of time on twice a week preparing for these conversations on various people's websites, trying to be a little bit more knowledgeable than I might actually be. And it is often a really frustrating experience. Your website is excellent. So whoever is responsible for your website, pat them on the back. It is easily navigatable or navigable. It is
Mhm.
all the information you could possibly want is there. There's enough beautiful pictures and graphics to make it not nerdy and geeky. It's really, really excellent. Thank you for that.
No, thank you. And that's Ryan Moore. That's kind of his vision, and then he's got this beautiful team around him to really make it work. And it cost a fortune to design it and keep it up to speed. But no, and we wanted it so that you could burrow down as much or as little as you wanted, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
No.
I asked Thomas that question at the end of the Zinfandel tasting, and he talked
Yes.
about going to this. One of his investors, I think, but anyway, a friend of his was the original chief information or chief technology officer at Microsoft. So he's very, very wealthy. He lives in Washington, Seattle somewhere. And Thomas was at his house, and he pulled a moderately young Bordeaux out of his wine cellar and poured everybody a glass, and it was nice, nothing extraordinary. And then he put it in a Vitamix blender and blended it up for 30 seconds and poured everybody another glass. And according to Thomas, it was a totally different and much better wine. And then he put a few grains of salt in each glass, and it was a totally different and much better wine.
Get out.
Which that's what Thomas said. Now, I don't know. And so he went back to the restaurant and told his sommelier at the time that he wanted to start Vitamixing and adding salt to the wines before he started. He was kidding, of course. But, yeah, that was an interesting response to your most memorable wine experience.
That's
and I mean,
pretty
it makes
amazing.
sense that adding salt to a young Bordeaux might brighten enhance the flavors. So that's what salt does.
And air, that makes sense. I mean, those silly little vortex pour spouts, they
Right.
work on young wines. They work really well.
Yeah, but a Vitamix is that's
pretty crazy. Especially if you got it to go all the way. I put it on 9 or something. Oh my
Right.
God. That's crazy.
Well, this has been absolutely fantastic, as I knew it would be. As I said early on, you have no greater fan of your wines than I am, and I've really been looking forward to this time with you, and it was everything I hoped it would be. And so thank you very
awesome.
much. And
No,
I know
you're
I think you're blending the 2000 Monte Bello
yes,
on
this
Thursday.
week. Thursday and
that goes
Friday.
well.
Yes.
I hope that
Thank
goes
you
well.
very much. Yep, it should. There's some really great tasting lots despite the fires. So
Yeah.
we're looking forward to it. Hoyt, this has been a great privilege. Thank you very much for interviewing me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David.
You bet. Awesome.
Bye.
Okay. Cheers.
Bye.